Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Murray Ray, and I'm glad to welcome you to this event on behalf of the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, part of the Department of Theology and Religion here at the University of Otago. We're very pleased to be hosting this event with support from the Venn Foundation. Sam Bloore himself is on the staff of the Venn Foundation, and we're glad to welcome the Director, Nathan McClellan, here as well. It's good to have you with us on this occasion. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Sam Bloore, studied medicine here at Otago, graduating in 1998. He then undertook a year of research in bioethics, where he assisted Professor Grant Gillett in drafting the first position paper on euthanasia for the New Zealand Medical Association. That was, at that stage, a response to the discussion that had been prompted by Michael Law's Death with Dignity Bill. Sam subsequently completed a Master's in Bioethics and Health Law, and later still an MA in Pastoral Theology. Sam's career path has taken him from clinical medicine through pastoral theology, talkback radio at one point, and as I said, he now works for the Venn Foundation, which provides internship and educational opportunities for young people and helps them to think through what it means to live life in the light of Christian faith. Sam's title tonight, as you can see, is Knockin' on Heaven's Door, Theology, Popular Culture, and New Zealand's Ongoing Fascination with Euthanasia. As is pointed out in the publicity material for this lecture, we now have before us the fourth bill promoted through Parliament to legalise euthanasia in New Zealand. Sam will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for conversation between us. It's important to say, I think, that this is an issue on which there will be a variety of opinion amongst us. It is also an issue that touches deep into our convictions about the value of human life, the dignity of human beings. It may well be an issue for some that touches deep into their personal experience of attending to others in the midst of their suffering. And so I hope that our conversation together will be conducted with the appropriate care and respect. I'm sure I can trust you all to engage in the conversation on those terms. But before we do that, I invite Sam Bloore to offer us his thoughts on the issue of euthanasia. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Murray. Guys, I've got 3 preschoolers at home in Auckland, so I just welcomed an opportunity to come down to Dunedin for 2 nights in a bed where I got to sleep in and leave my poor wife to attend to our 3. I think I might have promised Murray around 50 minutes. We may go a little longer than that. I am notorious for putting in far too many notes. If we do and we chop any Q&A time short, my apologies for that. I will stay around as long as people have got questions for me. I've got nowhere to be, no meeting after this. I just have to catch a flight at 10:30 tomorrow. So long as we're wrapped up the Q&A by then, we'll all be happy. Dystopian novels usually aren't my go-to resource for bioethical commentary, but I've opened talks on euthanasia with this quote before, and I do it again, beginning with this quote from Hal DeMario and David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. God seems to have a kind of laid-back management style I'm not crazy about. I'm pretty much anti-death, and God looks by all accounts to be pro-death. I'm not seeing how we can get together on this issue, he and I. Nothing like starting a lecture in a theology department in a rather irreverent way. But I start with that quote not just because it puts a tick in the theology and the popular culture box of my subtitle, but more importantly to acknowledge that whenever we begin talk of euthanasia or assisted suicide, as Murray has already alluded to, in fact, whenever we engage in any talk of death, we are entering pretty complex territory. We're entering what for some is very emotional territory, and for some of us is quite sacred territory. And like Hal, there are days where I too am not that crazy about God's kind of laid-back management style. This is a photo of my wife Julia and I in less sleep-deprived days on our wedding day with my parents. In this photo, That's my dad on the right. If he's looking a little short on sleep, and for him a little short on hair, it's because he's just finished his 5th round of chemotherapy, which he had over 7 years for lymphoma, and had had many periods of remission and then relapse with that. If he's looking a bit nervous, it's because he knows that in about an hour he has to give a speech. 3 months later, I got to return the favour at his funeral. It wasn't the best timing in the world, to be honest, newly married. But certainly for me, even as a former doctor, it was my most personal experience of a death. And I'm told actually by people who work in palliative care that this is not uncommon. Because now we live in quite discrete family units, most people's most intimate view of a death will be a parent, if their parents go before them. So there we were, his 5 children and their partners, 2 grandchildren, and of course mum, 14 of us all camped out Marais style up at the family home in Dargaville, attending in those final weeks to his medications, and then to his food, and then finally to his ablutions. Taking your own father to the toilet and cleaning him up afterwards is certainly a unique experience for a son. You might say it's a reversal of roles. Looking back on that period, though, I think we both managed to make it through with our dignity intact. And I'll have more to say on dignity later. But I know a little bit about what it feels like to have some skin in the game. In January of last year, I had the solemn privilege of leading the funeral of a friend who had passed away at 36 from a brain tumour, leaving a husband and a 2-year-old daughter. And then July last year, I had open heart surgery to repair a torn mitral valve, which was something at 42 of a confrontation with my own mortality. So this latest round of euthanasia, and if the heart surgery didn't make me feel old, then knowing that this is the 4th round of debate on this and the 4th bill that we have before us since I became embroiled in this discussion. It was Michael Law's bill when I was doing work with Grant Gillette, and then of course we had Peter Brown's, and then Marion Street's, and now David Seymour's. So this latest round has felt more personal because of the events of my own life that have passed since then. Some of you will remember the breaking of that story when the Lucretia Seals story came out, the young lawyer with a terminal brain tumour. Some of you may have seen this very article on the weekend papers of that weekend. There is actually a typo up there, 3rd line down. That should be euthanise rather than euthanise. In March 2015, she brought a case to the New Zealand High Court, effectively seeking a review of the laws surrounding euthanasia, and the widespread media coverage of her story catapulted us, as we've already said, into our 4th round of debate, our latest round of national debate on end-of-life issues. And it catapulted me back into the issue as well. As Murray's already said, deferring that year in the mid-90s, with Grant, we drafted the first sort of draft position paper for the New Zealand Medical Association. 20 years later, I think our culture and society have changed somewhat. I actually am still doing a little bit of talkback radio, Murray, not the midnight to 6s that I used to do. And bless you if you ever called during those hours. You might have been my one sane caller that I had during those years. I now do a rather more sedate time of 6 till 7:30 on News Talk ZB. I co-host a program called Total Recall, where we look at historical events and talk about their relevance to present day. So I still spend a lot of time talking to everyday New Zealanders about what's important in their lives. But there have been some changes, and given that I've had a career change and added a second master's in pastoral theology, I think I've changed a bit too. I've been fascinated by the way that Lucretia's story and other stories like her have been reported and discussed in the media. And that's from newspaper editorials right through to the way that people have talked about it on our programs. I've been even more fascinated by the way that some of the very complex surrounding issues have either been debated or not debated in the public square. I caught an Uber ride when I was in Australia last year talking at the Australian-New Zealand palliative medicine conference on some of the cultural difficulties of talking about dying in our cultural moment in time. I caught an Uber ride with a guy, and in 10 minutes, I think I had got him thinking more deeply about euthanasia than he had in the rest of his life, and so I now use cab rides for that purpose. It's costing me a fortune, but we're getting there. It also raised for me some interesting questions about what we value and why. More specifically, how do the features of our current cultural moment influence our ability to understand, to experience and to discuss death well? I've had to ask myself in recent years, should my own understanding be informed at all by my Christian faith? And if it is informed by my Christian faith, does that then disqualify me from the wider discussion, as a number of politicians and journalists have suggested? And that has very much surprised me as being a feature of this latest debate, and in the way that many of the arguments being raised have been treated and sidelined for that reason. So I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time, because we are talking at a Centre for Theology and Public Issues lecture, about that phenomenon. One of the journalists that has been the most outspoken I could find, and the clearest on this, I discovered several months ago, and I've read most of his contributions to the conversation. His name is Graham Adams. He's a frequent contributor to Metro magazine. And his contributions to the conversation have included, at least the ones I could find on the noted website, the God Squad rules, the politics of euthanasia, fighting in the shadows, the religious flank and voluntary euthanasia. MPs opposed to euthanasia will be uncomfortable this year. That was after the bill actually got pulled out of the ballot. Now, it seems a bit unfair to single Graham Adams out as though he's the only one who thinks this way. I'm sure he's not. But his articulation of how people with religious commitments ought to conduct themselves in this conversation is certainly the clearest articulation of it that I've found. And so he writes this in Fighting in the Shadows. Opponents of David Seymour's bill are not going to let the facts get in the way of their story, especially those whose religious beliefs dictate their view. As Seymour noted in a party newsletter, the Bible says, "Thou shalt not lie," but some assisted dying opponents must think they're specially exempted. If they're not breaking the letter of the commandments, they are certainly outside their spirit. We do not say this lightly. The dishonesty in their campaign is breathtaking. The dishonesty, this is going on to in Graham's voice now, the dishonesty does not lie solely in ignoring the evidence from countries where assisted dying laws have worked successfully, sometimes for decades. We'll get to those in a moment. It lies also in the fact that religious opponents often don't declare their religious motivation because they know it will work against them. Many of us see religion as little more than medieval superstition, and the proportion of the irreligious in New Zealand is probably at least 50%, so arguments framed in religious terms will cut little ice with most people. Mounting only religion-free arguments is the clearest indication of how much the churches have lost their once supreme moral authority in the community. Their relentless hugging of the shadows in a debate that goes to the core of their beliefs is an indication of defeat and of their terminal weakness. Anyone who has a deep religious conviction that rejects any human interference in what they consider to be the natural lifespan ordained by God is not putting all their cards on the table if they don't explicitly argue that position, because if they did, they would have to admit that there is absolutely no evidence that would change their minds, no matter how compelling. I worry if fundraising gets difficult, changing the name to the medieval superstitious studies might get you a bit more money rolling in. Now, I'll get to that first charge of dishonesty and some of the experiences overseas in a moment. Certainly, I know the researchers who are accused of breaking the 9th commandment, and they would strongly deny the charge. But for now, I want to focus on that second charge of dishonesty. I'll leave it to Professor David Toombs, Murray, and the rest of the team here at the Centre to better explain how and how often theology should contribute to public and political discussions. But I do want to respond from a personal point of view to the suggestion that those with religious views need to put all their cards on the table, that in my case it's intellectually dishonest of me to mount only religion-free arguments. More importantly, I want to respond to why Graham Adams thinks it's intellectually dishonest, i.e. I would have to admit that there is absolutely no evidence that would change my mind, no matter how compelling. Here I think Mr. Adams is conflating two domains. He is correct when he suggests that because of my religious convictions, there's absolutely no evidence that would change my mind insofar as actions I would pursue and accept in my own life are concerned. That is, regardless of a law change, I will not be pursuing euthanasia for my own kith and kin. But he is quite incorrect when he extends that to suggest that because of my religious convictions, there is no evidence that would change my mind insofar as my opposing a law change goes. If Mr. Seymour or Mr. Adams could provide me with this compelling evidence that the goalposts for euthanasia will not and will never shift, then I would certainly tone down my opposition. In fact, on my less charitable days, I find myself musing that if we could guarantee that the only people who would avail themselves of euthanasia were those of us who were as sure of themselves as these two, I might quickly become an enthusiastic supporter of a law change. People of religious persuasion walk this tension all the time. They are quite used to their own beliefs holding them to a different, in some cases you might argue a higher standard than the law. As an example, there are days where I find myself wondering, given the misery that I've observed both in hospital practice and in church life, whether maybe the seventh commandment should also be enshrined in a bill, thou shalt not commit adultery. But of course I don't pursue that. I don't force the fact that I happen to think marital fidelity is a personal and a social good onto Mr. Seymour or Mr. Adams or anyone else, and I certainly don't do it through the law. But this euthanasia discussion is quite different. Because I've found their evidence and assurances thoroughly not compelling, I'm not satisfied to stay quiet and let the legal chips fall where they may, to sit at home content in the knowledge that whatever happens, I will live by my own religious standard and that at least euthanasia won't cross my threshold. It's precisely because the euthanasia test, I think, fails at this level of evidence and assurances that I continue to make the arguments that I do. This doesn't mean that I've embraced a public-private dualism with regards to my religion. Quite the opposite. I think there are many times where the church feels a pastoral or a prophetic burden to remind the wider public that there exists, at least to them, a theological and or spiritual dimension to an issue. And I think euthanasia has been one of those times. But I think the church also knows that sometimes that reminder will be surprisingly well received, even by those who don't share those religious convictions, and other times it will be scoffed at as medieval superstition. It will cut little ice. The level of scoffing in this debate has been high. The inference seems to be that confessing to a religious faith places a cloud of suspicion and cynicism over anything else that proceeds out of one's mouth. And so manoeuvres like this to clump together and discredit any and all of the arguments by those who hold to such nonsense, unfortunately, has been quite common. As I mentioned, I've only picked on Graham Adams' material because he articulates it so well, but David Seymour has repeatedly made such comments about some of his own parliamentary colleagues, and to the 78% of those who made oral submissions to the Health Select Committee. One might say that the dishonesty seems breathtaking. So I'm not surprised at all to find that politicians and others who hold religious views argue non-medieval arguments. It makes perfect sense by Graham Adams' own standards. And I think especially when we live in the age of the soundbite. One can only make a certain number of arguments and emotional appeals. One is hardly going to waste them on ones that cut little ice. 15 minutes into my talk, I've already been speaking about 3 times longer than the average interview you will hear on any media platform on this subject. One of my colleagues several years ago, Jane, was interviewed back in 2015 on News Talk ZB, Mike Hosking's morning program. It was a 5-minute interview that was squeezed in between an item about gun control in the United States and a discussion about a rather pessimistic Aucklander who'd placed a $130,000 bet that the All Blacks would lose the World Cup that year. In his outstanding book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business, Neil Postman describes and prophesies the dumbing down of North American society as entertainment increasingly spills over the boundaries of its own industry and infiltrates education, politics, religion, and journalism. In a chapter titled, Now This, he writes, the American humorist H. Allen Smith once suggested that of all the worrisome words in the English language, the scariest is uh-oh, as in when the physician looks at your x-rays with a knitted brow and says, uh-oh. I would like to suggest that the words that are the title of this chapter, Now This, are as ominous as any, all the more so because they're spoken without knitted brow, indeed with a kind of idiot's delight. The phrase, if that's what it may be called, adds to our grammar a new part of speech, a conjunction which does not connect anything to anything, but does the opposite. It separates everything from everything, and as such it serves a compact metaphor for the discontinuities in so much that passes for public discourse in present-day America. Now this is commonly used on radio and television newscasts to indicate that what one has just heard or seen has no relevance to what one is about to hear or see, or possibly to anything that anyone is ever likely to hear or see. The phrase is a means of acknowledging the fact that the world as mapped by the speeded-up electronic media has no order or meaning and is not to be taken seriously. There is no murder so brutal, no earthquake so devastating, no political blunder so costly for that matter, no ball score so tantalising, or weather report so threatening that it cannot be erased from our minds by a newscaster saying, "And now this." The newscaster means that you've thought long enough on that previous matter, approximately 45 seconds, that you must not be morbidly preoccupied with it and that you must now give your attention to another fragment of news or a commercial. For those who think I'm here guilty of hyperbole, I offer the following description of television news by Robert McNeil, Executive Director and co-anchor of the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. He writes, "The idea is to keep everything brief, not to strain the attention of anyone, but instead to provide constant stimulation through variety, novelty, action and movement. You're required to pay attention to no concept, no character, and no problem for more than a few seconds at a time." He goes on to say that the assumptions controlling a news show are that bite-sized is best, that complexity must be avoided, that nuances are dispensable, that qualifications impede the simple message, that visual stimulation is a substitute for thought, and that verbal precision is an anachronism. No matter how grave any fragment of news may appear, for example, on the day I'm writing, a Marine Corps general has declared that nuclear war between the United States and Russia is inevitable. It will shortly be followed by a series of commercials that will in an instant diffuse the import of the news, in fact, render it largely banal. We've become so accustomed to its discontinuities that we are no longer struck dumb, as any sane person would be, by a newscaster who, having just reported that a nuclear war is inevitable, goes on to say that he will be right back after this word from Burger King, who says in other words, "Now this." One can hardly overestimate the damage that such juxtapositions do to our sense of the world as a serious place. It's incredible that Postman was making these observations and predictions back in 1985. 3 decades later, here's a typical news feed that I captured on my phone for a talk last year, 3rd of August 2016, 2 p.m. Stop putting these foods in your fridge. Cricket rape trial hung jury. Mum pole dances through labour. Celebs obsessed with Pokemon Go. Triathlon series schedule announced. Cow ramming ends in suspension. Instagram cat shoots lasers out of eyes. New hurdle in a 40-year-old cold case murder. Court demands changes to Three Kings building project plans. Tiger, hip-hop artist, slammed for neglecting his former pet tiger. Young mum's bowel cancer battle. Baseball elbow injury. World's hottest woman shares insecurities. We can all hear the violins playing on that one. Something about rugby league. Briscoe's profits soar 32%. 7 real live dates for The Bachelorette. And a couple of our local young men killed in a car crash. This juxtaposition is pretty typical. We're fed an unending torrent of information designed to titillate or outrage us without any limits or filters or triage, in fact, almost no clues at all from the media or wider culture about what is truly important. So I just want to congratulate you for giving up an evening to be here. You've already done more than most by dedicating just this next hour and a half or so to thinking through some of the complexities of this issue, and I'm sure some of you have been doing it for many, many years, even longer than I have. And so by doing this, by thinking it through in an environment where you will have potentially some of your thoughts around it challenged, pushed back on, some discussion which we'll get to soon, rather than simply reinforced, another feature of our current cultural moment is that we have so much information available to us of varying quality that it is, of course, possible to access only opinion that will amplify one's blind spots, rather than actually calling them out. Earlier this year, 2 opponents of euthanasia in the UK came out to New Zealand to share their experiences. Robert Preston is the director of the UK think tank Living and Dying Well, and Baroness Alora Finlay, Professor of Palliative Care Medicine in Cardiff and an independent crossbench member at the House of Lords. I'll be including a number of their observations and their quotes tonight, but here's Robert Preston explaining why some of that oversimplification that I've just been describing makes public opinion polling quite difficult to interpret. He's responding to the question, why not put this to a referendum?
The problem with referenda, actually, is that they invite yes or no answers to very complex questions. I'm not sure there is a yes or no answer to this question. Now, you know, it may appear that because I've been speaking against change in the law, I'm an absolutist. I'm not. I can actually see a case, possibly, for this to happen in certain circumstances, but that's not the question. The question is, should you set up a licensing system for it? Now, I'm actually straying away from the question here. Should there be a referendum? It's linked to the issue of opinion polling, isn't it? I mean, opinion polling, we're told, opinion polling is a means of testing public opinion, as is a referendum. Opinion polling, we're told, says 75% of people want to see a law changed. But opinion polls depend on the way questions are phrased, the way they are sequenced. They also depend on what knowledge respondents have of the subject. And this links us to referenda again. Most of us lead busy lives. We have only got the time and the patience to know about perhaps 3 or 4 subjects really well that are of immediate relevance to us. Whether we care to admit it or not, for most of the things we have views on, we depend on what we read in the press or hear on the radio or see on television. And those things tend to be the exceptional ones. That somebody who is making a particular case for a change in the law, the press reports the exceptional. It doesn't do it out of malice, it just needs to sell papers. And I'm afraid what happens every day to most people doesn't sell papers. I mean, look, let me give you an example. When was the last time you heard that flight NZ415 landed safely at Auckland? You won't hear it because it happens every night. And that is the problem, that, you know, levels of information, levels of analysis on this are not high. And I'm sorry if that sounds anti-democratic, but this is a very important decision. It is a life or death issue for large numbers of people. And simply to put it before them on a yes or no basis, say that or that, just doesn't work, I'm afraid.
So moving on to a brief outline of where I want to go in the next 30, 40 minutes. The main arguments for euthanasia broadly, as I've observed them, fit under 3 headings: suffering, dignity and autonomy. There's been something of an evolution even in the short time, 20 years or so, that I've been involved in the discussion. Really, it used to be a lot of talk of sort of pain and suffering, and that hasn't been used as much as palliative care has increased, and as the number of cases where intractable pain and suffering become less and less. And I want to acknowledge that there aren't no cases of that, but they are becoming less. The arguments have shifted, the focus has shifted, even the wording of the bills has shifted. We've gone from death with dignity to end-of-life choices. It might sound, when I talk of changes of arguments, of minimal cases, that I'm being flippant about them, and I was determined tonight to not let my tone get that way. So if it is getting that way, if it is getting somewhat dismissive, I do apologise. I want to acknowledge that there are cases which, if they don't move you, you want to check your pulse. Robert Preston's making that very point. Anyone who can't imagine themselves being pushed pretty close to the brink of seeing euthanasia as a good option just needs to imagine a scenario a little worse and a little longer, and you'll get there. But as he says, the question before us aren't those extremely difficult, extremely moving cases. The question before us is, in solving those, will we be creating much bigger problems? I want to look at these actually in reverse order. I'm going to look at autonomy first, then dignity and suffering. I'm going to look at some theological reflections against David Seymour and Graham Adams' better judgment. We are in a theology department after all. And then some other reflections. I did have someone in a previous talk try and read a little too much into the colour coding that I've used here, as though somehow the theological ones were warmer than the cold, nasty blue ones. If I'd switched them around, they would have wondered whether the the theology ones were nice and cool and the other ones were hellishly hot or something. Don't read too much. I've just simply tried to separate them out visually for you. Under autonomy, in some ways, when I talk of theological reflections and other reflections, I'm making somewhat of an arbitrary distinction. And some people here, especially in a theology department, would say I'm making quite an unscriptural distinction, that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And I think people of faith should be involved in all of them. I guess I am trying to, in the blue corner, if you like, give some arguments that aren't quite so heavy with the Christian jargon. So when it comes to autonomy, a couple of theological reflections. I think really when we reflect on our autonomy, anyone certainly of Christian faith, you can't be talking about autonomy long without reminding yourself that you're a creature, that there is a creator-creature divide, and that our autonomy has limits, death being one of them. For the entire history of the church, pretty much exclusively, the phrase right to die has been somewhat of a contradiction in terms. There's a notion of a power too great for humans to safely possess. Think sort of Garden of Eden, think Lord of the Rings. You want that thing so badly, once you've got it, you're not quite sure how to contain it. We'll hear more on that from people in the Netherlands. I think as people of Christian faith, other faiths I'm sure, understanding the nature and consequences of community. Now, people of faith aren't the only ones who do community, but certainly Christians take some of their cues from Scripture and from the church historical about what community looks like, that even our individuality has limits. We're called to celebrate and to bear things together. I'm going to move quite quickly through some of these. Some of the maths majors in the room would have seen 3 headings times 4 points each and done a quick calculation and started to panic, but we will move quite quickly. Some other reflections. We're more connected than we think we are. No man is an island, as John Donne once said. And we sometimes limit our autonomy to protect ourselves and others. If you listen to some of the disabled voices on this issue, I had one friend tell me that he very much needs the protection of the law to actually get him through the dark times, the dark seasons, that for him have lasted weeks, sometimes months, sometimes entire half years. To explain this connection and connectedness a little further, I'm actually going to play a clip of myself at an earlier talk that I gave. Partly it's for the novelty value. I've never been able to introduce a clip by me before, and partly it's just so I can have a bit of a break and blow my nose again. I am suffering a cold that just won't go away. This is from a talk I gave back in 2015. To minimise confusion, I've worn the same T-shirt and jacket top. So hopefully it doesn't throw you too much. There is a growing amount of commentary around our connectedness, our disconnectedness, our dependence on each other, or our independence from each other, and of course the effects that technology is or isn't having on our relationships. Certainly being independent and autonomous are highly prized. But I'm not so sure that we can erase our interconnectedness quite so easily. In 1624, the poet John Donne wrote, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." John Donne is highlighting that there is a value to human life that is inalienable, and there is a connectedness that is inalienable. We can't opt out of it even if we think we can. UK writer and journalist Douglas Murray wrote, There is, after all, the greatest difference between deciding to take your own life and having the law help you to do so. We do not live on islands of absolute solitude. What you choose to do with your body might very well have an effect on what someone else does with theirs. An inalienable connectedness. When Lucretia Seals passed away, we all felt it, as we should. I wonder if we would have been feeling exactly the same or somewhat different if the law had changed. And I wonder whether her assisted suicide, had it been allowed, would have sent any mixed messages to our young adults. Look at any graph of the OECD figures for youth suicide, and you can pick any year in the last decade, and it's not a pretty picture for New Zealand. Once suicide is widely legitimised as a solution, we don't get to contain the message as to who picks it up as a solution for them. That toothpaste is out of the tube. As well as proving that I can't pronounce the word inalienable, that clip draws the distinction between euthanasia and suicide, and I am running the risk of getting a text from Bill English on this one, as Simon O'Connor did during the campaign for daring to make that association. I did feel that the level of media indignation was somewhat out of proportion on that one. I can't believe Simon O'Connor would have the gall and the callousness to draw a link between suicide and assisted suicide. It's outrageous. They're very different. That may well be. I think there are differences. I'm sure Simon O'Connor knows that there are differences. But there are similarities as well, and not just in name. I think one of the points that Simon O'Connor was trying to make, and we can question the wisdom of doing it during an election campaign, was really that it doesn't matter how much of a difference he sees or that I see. The question is, how much of a difference does a suicidal 14-year-old see? That's the question that I think Simon O'Connor was trying to bring to our attention. So sometimes we limit our autonomy to protect ourselves and others. Another question we might want to consider is, what will the effects of this be on grandchildren? Almost everything that I've heard, written and said, takes the children's account in of people who want euthanasia. But those children are usually in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s or older. There's often a next generation watching as well. And some commentators are wondering, they don't know, they're just asking the question, just as we underestimated the ability of some children to draw completely erroneous conclusions that implicated themselves in their parents' divorce, some commentators are wondering if we're about to underestimate the impact of assisted suicide of a grandparent on grandchildren and their potential to draw erroneous conclusions about the part they played or did not play in some of those decisions. Certainly it's worth remembering the words of Dame Cicely Saunders, considered the founder of the modern hospice movement: how we die remains in the memory of those who live on. The last thing I want to say on autonomy is that autonomy is a fluid concept. And I probably don't have to tell most people in the room that you will have had times in your own life, even as a reasonably fit and well person, where you didn't feel quite in control of your life as other times. Autonomy is open to coercion. The elderly, the vulnerable, the depressed, the grieving. The most vocal calls for euthanasia are coming from those whose autonomy is and has always been strong, at least the ones that make the papers. Theirs has not yet been compromised by age, illness, or depression. In an August 2015 article for the Wall Street Journal titled "A Doctor-Assisted Disaster for Medicine," Professor William Toffler wrote about his experiences in Oregon. Since the voters of Oregon narrowly legalised physician-assisted suicide 20 years ago, there's been a profound shift in attitude towards medical care, new fear and secrecy, and a fixation on death. Well over 850 people have taken their lives by ingesting massive overdoses of barbiturates prescribed under the law. Proponents claim that the system is working well with no problems. This is not true. As a professor of family medicine at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, as well as a licensed physician for 35 years, I've seen firsthand how the law has changed the relationship between doctors and patients, some of whom now fear they are being steered towards assisted suicide. In one case, a patient with bladder cancer contacted me. She was concerned that an oncologist treating her might be one of the death doctors, and she questioned his motives. This was particularly worrying to her after she obtained a second opinion from another oncologist who was more positive about her prognosis and treatment options. Whichever of the consultants was right, he says, is immaterial. This is a fear that never even had to exist before. Returning for a moment to David Seymour's claim of commandment-breaking dishonesty, I'm not sure how you can report that dishonestly. I have cut and pasted those paragraphs as they appear in the Wall Street Journal online, and here's a graph of what is happening in Oregon. I think the burden of proof lies with Mr. Seymour to explain how such changes in trust between doctors and their patients will not take place here. In the meantime, I'm going to run with the opinion of the professor of family medicine who's been practicing for longer than Mr. Seymour has been alive, and doing so in a jurisdiction that has had assisted suicide for 2 decades for him to observe trends. And this isn't just any Johnny on the street, this is the professor of family medicine at Portland University in Oregon. Finally, it's impossible to talk about the fluidity of autonomy without also saying something about the complexity and the potential dysfunction of families. My experience in medicine, church and talkback radio has convinced me that unfortunately most of us underestimate the prevalence and the severity of family dysfunction in New Zealand. Most of the high-profile cases calling for euthanasia or assisted suicide seem to come from very stable and loving backgrounds. Some of you in this room will hold the views you do because of how stable and loving the situation was that you had to endure. But introduce any one of a number of variables and things can very quickly become incredibly complex. Cultural differences, financial complexity, divorce and remarriage, sibling rivalry, past history of physical or sexual abuse within the family. Even previously close and supportive families can experience considerable tension when everyone is having to process the confusion and the grief of a new diagnosis. Changing the law would effectively force every single family of a terminally ill person into the awkward situation of having to have, or perhaps worse, realising that they were not having, a discussion around euthanasia. This was the 10-minute conversation I had in my Uber ride in Melbourne. A guy who had watched his mother die the previous year and had said, hearing that I was talking about death and dying at palliative care, I think we need euthanasia in Australia. He was as opinionated as most cabbies I've spent time with. I asked him how that went for his mother. He admitted that it hadn't gone too badly. I asked how his family were. He said, great. I asked how he got on with his siblings. He said, fine. I said, oh, imagine if you didn't. Imagine if there was money involved and one of you was written out of the will. Imagine if there were step-siblings involved. Imagine if one of you had actually been abused by your mother and the others didn't know. Throw in any level of complexity, I left the guy with a lot to think about. Dignity. Very quickly, just some Christian reflections on this. The image of God lies pretty much at the heart of this. Imago Dei. Dignity is bestowed. It's not achieved. You can bestow dignity on someone, and we should be bestowing dignity on people in some very, quote-unquote, undignified circumstances. I think Christianity also seeks to subvert what some of our natural understandings are of just who is dignified and who isn't. They were very dignified. So-and-so was very dignified, We hear a lot in Scripture about the least of these, about the weak, about the poor, about the widow, about the orphan. There's something of a subversive upending of what true dignity looks like and doesn't look like. Moving on to some other reflections. First thing I'd want to say is that it can take a long time to process a perceived loss of dignity. It can take a long time. When Alora Finlay was over she pointed out that this is part of a doctor's job, is actually to narrow the gap between their expectation and the current reality of their health. That's actually what a doctor does a lot of the time, and not, I would add to what her observation was, not just in palliative care. I can remember an emergency department, sort of trying to bridge the gap between the expectation of a roofing contractor who had fallen and whose ankle was the size of a football, but was expecting to be on a roof tomorrow morning to complete a job. There is somewhat of a discrepancy between expectation and health, and we have to somehow narrow that gap. Sometimes that has happened over time with a deteriorating condition. Other times it happens catastrophically and very traumatically, very tragically. But we find ourselves in this situation, and what the doctor is trying to do, along with many others in a medical team and with family, is to somehow narrow that gap. Sometimes you're able to do it by bringing in the best case scenario is actually the expectation stays high and you bring the health back up to match it, as you can do for a broken bone or other things. You wait long enough and it will get back up there. Sometimes though you have to do it, you have to bring the expectation down. The health will actually never quite return back to what it was. Other times you're actually having to do it while the health continues to deteriorate. But palliative care doctors will tell you you're still able to actually do that and make some inroads. But here's the thing, they say, it takes time. And it can take a long time and much longer than any of the cooling off periods that you will see in euthanasia legislation. Baroness Finlay has chuckled every time I've heard her read out what the cooling off periods are, compared to what she sees as the timeframes of people getting to grips with a change in their health. And it takes a long time, and especially when I think most of us kind of view our life as this kind of complete pie that slowly gets nibbled away by kind of turning 30 and then turning 40 and then having a heart valve repair, and before you know it, you're left with a kind of a fragment of the health you used to enjoy. And I don't want to make light of that. Sometimes there is a catastrophic change to the way that someone's life is, and it's irreversible. But again, Laura Finlay tells the story of going to see a 22-year-old who'd become a tetraplegic in a collapsed rugby scrum. For 2 years on the rehabilitation ward, he asked to be euthanised. He asked if he could die. She moved on from that particular ward, or he did, and she lost contact with him. She went to catch up with him a few years later. She was passing through where he lived. She got in touch and he asked if she would come around and see him, and she said she would. She was somewhat dreading going around given the state that she had last left him in. She walked into his home and said that everywhere, his entire lounge, was bookshelves. She sort of said, what's going on? And he said from his, his very elaborate wheelchair and other things around him, he was still tetraplegic. I've discovered books. He said, I've been in rep rugby teams and rep sports teams since I was about 9. Shuttled this way and that to all sorts of practices and everything. It took a long time, but I've actually, I've re-enrolled, I'm doing further study. She said it takes time to actually form a new life around any fragment that's left. And it takes way longer than a fortnight, which is what the cooling off period has been placed at in certain legislation suggestions we've had. The other thing I want to say about dignity is, like autonomy, it's not an individual concept. When you call a condition undignified, unfortunately, you send a message to everyone who's got that condition, even if you didn't intend to. I'm going to show you a couple of quick clips by a comedian called Liz Carr. She's from the UK, and as you'll see, she's profoundly disabled. She talks a little bit about this whole idea of dignity.
Most of us have lived with the kind of things that people are scared of. I understand that if you become disabled or ill, you don't want pain, you don't want suffering, whatever that means.
Sure.
And people are afraid of loss of dignity and loss of autonomy. And lots of us live with those experiences. I can't go to the loo on my own, I can't do many things on my own, but I know that there's still a sense that that doesn't make me undignified. In the UK, when we discuss this subject, the people who propose it and want it are usually disabled but not terminally ill. And of course, most people who become or are terminally ill do have some element of disability. And what happens is, medically and in the public view, it's often one and the same. So I've had people say to me, my goodness, if I was like you, I don't know how I'd cope, to be honest. There's such negativity around disability that if I said that I wanted to die, it wouldn't take much for my doctor to say, you know what, I can understand that. I can see it would be a compassionate thing. So there's I think we have such negativity and no equality in many respects as disabled people, and there's such a fine line between the two areas that it's very much a disability rights issue.
I've got a friend who's a winemaker at a well-known winery in New Zealand. I won't say the name of it. I'm partial to one of their Chardonnays and would buy it by the caseload when he invited me along to their staff kind of discount sales on the weekends. But I kind of ditched him when I discovered that Countdown was doing it for $14 a bottle. I bought 3 cases, and next time I caught up with him, I broke the news, expecting him to be quite happy, but he just exploded. And I said, hey, mate, what's the? I was a bit offended. I thought he'd be, happy at my good fortune. But he looked at me and said, mate, that's not a $14 bottle of wine. It's a $28 bottle of wine. I can't buy it for anything like $14, even with my winemaker's discount. And he said, here's the thing, you'll never look at that as a $28 bottle of wine again. You'll never pay full price for it again. It's changed for you. And he's right, I never have. Here's the thing, I think when the first person in New Zealand with multiple sclerosis is given euthanasia, you'll never look at multiple sclerosis the same way again, or motor neurone disease, or anything else. There will be whether you want to or not, there will have been a leaching of that label beyond that one person that had it into every bottle of wine that bears that label. If you think that sounds a bit, I'm indulging in hyperbole, I want to just read you out a couple of details from a story by a guy called Gerbert van Lernen in the UK. Society's understanding of dignity, not the UK, the Netherlands, if the Netherlands is anything to go by, society's understanding of dignity can and does change over time. And this is where, for me, it gets a little bit chilling. That the law won't just change for all of us, the law will change us. Another way of putting it might be that legalization becomes normalization, becomes expectation. So Gerbert van Lernen is a journalist. Apologies if you're Dutch, I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of his name. He was deputy editor for a daily Amsterdam newspaper, Tro newspaper. In 1994, his partner Nick went in for the removal of a small benign brain tumour. There were complications and he was left profoundly disabled. They considered their options. Gerbert rearranged his life to provide care at home. After 4 years, Nick had to be moved into a care facility, but survived another 6 years in that facility with reasonable quality of life. But what surprised and shocked Gerbert van Lernen was some of the things that were said to them by certain friends. It would have been better if Nick had died, one said at the outset. Another told them when they expressed frustration, you chose to go on living, so you've got no right to complain. In other words, you had a fork in the road, you made your call, you've forfeited the right to grizzle if you've had a bad day. He was stunned by the change of attitudes in his fellow countrymen in the decade that Nick was alive. He wrote a book in 2015 called Do You Call This a Life? Blurred Boundaries in the Netherlands' Right to Die Laws. Once he says, an average Dutchman who thought of euthanasia as one of the crown jewels of our liberal country, I became someone who was shocked by the harsh tone used by the Dutch when they talked about handicapped life. He was so keen for New Zealanders to hear the full story that he actually made a submission to our Health Select Committee from Amsterdam. He appeared on TV3's Sunday program several months ago, Sunday program TV3, I think it is. He expressed concern at the constant widening of the Netherlands' euthanasia practice. Here's what he said on that program. We started with cases of people suffering, this is only 4 or 5 weeks ago on our television. We started with cases of people suffering from physical diseases, and now we're talking about termination of life for babies with spina bifida. Today we're talking of assisted suicide for elderly people who are not ill, but who are weary of life. You know, in the past it was easy. There was this obvious limit, thou shalt not kill. And then we broke that rule, and we're still looking for the new limit. We don't know how far we should go. You can't speak on this and not speak of suffering, and I'll close on, with some points on suffering. I want to begin by saying that to me this is the most compelling of the arguments. As I said earlier, if you're not moved by Lucretia Seal's story, by any of the other stories that have made headlines, then you want to check for a beating heart. It's deeply moving to hear stories of people who die in ways that have considerable amounts of pain or suffering attached to them. But I do want to say a couple of things. I'm going to do this in reverse order, talk to some other reflections, and then close with a little bit of challenge for those of us in the room that might profess to have a Christian faith. I do want to say about suffering that I've learned a lot by being on several panels in the last couple of years with palliative care doctors. And I realised that actually all doctors aren't created equal, that palliative care doctors know way more than I ever knew about caring for the terminally ill and the dying. And they tell me, as of several months ago when I last was in contact with them, that there are huge advances in palliative care. That to quote figures from 10, even 5 years ago, 5 years can be an enormous amount of time in medicine in terms of advances that are made. Most of us, even some doctors, and I would consider myself one, we've got quite outdated understandings of dying. As I said, people often don't see another one until another parent passes away. The way in which both of my grandparents passed away was very, very different to the way that my father did. That was about 15 years apart, incredibly different. It would be different now, even 7 years on, from my own father passing away. The other thing to say about this, just to return to autonomy for a moment, is that not many people have a good understanding of the rights that they've already got in the healthcare system when it comes to refusing medical treatments, and even treatment that's extending their life. That's not considered euthanasia, but very few people can articulate those rights well, if in fact they even know them, and even fewer can do it when they're suddenly thrust into the chaotic and rather disempowering setting of a hospital. But when those rights are carefully explained in advance and fears of overly burdensome treatments are allayed, palliative care doctors will tell you that almost everyone withdraws their requests for voluntary euthanasia. Rob McLeod, who I was on a panel with 2 years ago, is now in his 60s and has been a palliative care doctor for decades, says he's only had one patient in all of his career. He's had lots of patients ask for it, but as he's worked on what the reasons are for them asking for it, he said there was only one that repeatedly would ask him every day. And it became almost a bit of a running joke with him where he'd say, well, what about today, Jim? Oh, not today, doctor, not today. But palliative care doctors have got a very different take on this. So refusing treatment isn't euthanasia, nor is receiving a course of treatment to treat symptoms that may result in death being hastened. And there will be treatments we can think of that do that. When you have quite radical chemo or radiotherapy to shrink tumours that are crushing on nerves and causing pain, you know that there are organ systems that are going to be just affected by that, and it will be hastening death. But you do it. That's not euthanasia. That's good clinical practice. But again, as Robert Preston mentioned, the Snap Digipole isn't going to tease out the nuance of that. The other thing I want to say before moving on to a couple of theological reflections is that suffering is subjective by definition, and that's why no safeguards are are working. And I do just want to play just a few-minute clip, again from Robert Preston, as he offers some preliminary analysis of the provisions of David Seymour's bill. He does it much more succinctly than I can, and with a bit more authority. So I'm just going to play this for you, and then we'll bring it into land. Or I may have to press play on this one, I think. No, am I going backwards? What am I doing here? Let me just see if I can.
Comment. It's a preliminary analysis of the provisions of David Seymour's end-of-life choice bill. There are a lot of euphemisms in this debate. There is only one bill that has actually given the label on the tin to match the contents. That is the Dutch Euthanasia bill. Do you know what that's called? It's called the Termination of Life on Request and Assisted Suicide Bill. You've got to admire the Dutch for their frankness. Mr. Seymour's bill, what would it legalise? And I'm quoting from the bill here. The administration by a medical practitioner of a lethal dose of medication to a person to relieve his or her suffering by hastening death. In other words, the doctor injects you with lethal drugs. But there is apparently a choice between a doctor injecting you and supplying you with lethal drugs to take yourself. What the bill would legalise is what is known in the trade as physician-assisted euthanasia, that's where a doctor injects you, PAE, or physician-assisted suicide, PAS, where a doctor supplies you with drugs, take home and take yourself. What are the criteria? Who would actually be eligible for this? There are medical criteria, first of all. Someone who has a terminal illness and has been given a prognosis of 6 months or less, that's the same as Oregon. Or someone who has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which is very much wider, and is in an advanced state of irreversible decline and capacity. And there are other criteria. Someone who experiences unbearable suffering that cannot be relieved in a manner that he or she considers tolerable, and has the ability to understand, 1, the nature of assisted dying, and 2, the consequences for him or her of assisted dying. Now, let's take the first one. How easy is it to say someone is likely to die within 6 months? The select committee that I referred to received evidence from experts on this. The Royal College of General Practitioners in the UK said it is possible to make reasonably accurate prognoses of death within minutes, hours, or a few days. When this stretches to months, then the scope for error can extend into years. The Royal College of Physicians said prognosticating may be better when they're within the last 2 or 3 weeks of their life. When they are 6 or 8 months away, it's actually pretty desperately hopeless as an accurate factor.
You getting it now? Coming through? When you have subjectivity in a safeguard, the goalposts are going to move. Once a right to die is established, then the right seeks to universalise itself. That's the whole point of a human right. And by talking about end-of-life choices and basing it in and around that, it's little wonder that those who are initially outside of the criteria start to ask, what makes your version of suffering unique, that you get to opt in on this and that I don't? So among those euthanized in Belgium in the last few years, deaf 45-year-old twins who are going blind, a 44-year-old woman with chronic anorexia nervosa, and a 64-year-old woman with chronic depression, and that was without informing her family. And here is the graph of the way things have gone in Belgium. It's important to note that the cases I selected out there are not cases where the goalposts have been moved by anybody else. They're moving because the patients themselves want to opt in and have the goalposts moved. Canada's only had legislation for a little over a year, and it's already got cases before its courts wanting to stretch it from terminal medical conditions to dementia and to psychiatric conditions. They've had it less than a year, just over a year. So when I read this from Graham Adams, I wonder whether we're on the same planet. Assisted dying legislation in other countries hasn't led to abuse or vulnerable people being pressured, and the slippery slope argument is basically a paternalistic, anti-democratic position of if we give you an inch, you'll take a mile. Given that these positions are weak, especially now that there is so much evidence from so many jurisdictions where assisted dying is being used successfully, religious opponents are forced to use tactics of misinformation and fear-mongering. Australian TV presenter and assisted dying campaigner Andrew Denton calls these tactics FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt. Now, acronyms like FUD are useful rhetorical tools in a public debate because, after all, who wants to be accused of fudding? But Andrew Denton and Graham Adams forget that there's no need to conjure up uncertainty and doubt when you have actual evidence from other jurisdictions staring you in the face. There's no need to imagine a fearful counterfactual when you have a counterfactual from another jurisdiction right in front of you. What they call fudding, some might call due diligence. Theo Boer is a professor of ethics and a member of the Euthanasia Review Committee in the Netherlands. In 2007, I wrote that there doesn't need to be a slippery slope when it comes to euthanasia. A good euthanasia law, in combination with the euthanasia review procedure, provides the warrant for a stable and relatively low number of euthanasia cases. Most of my colleagues drew the same conclusion, but we were wrong, terribly wrong in fact. Beginning in 2008, the numbers of these deaths showed an increase of 15% annually, year after year. Euthanasia is on the way to becoming a default mode of dying for cancer patients. The Dutch Right to Die Society shows no sign of being satisfied even with these developments. They will not rest until a lethal pill is made available to anyone over 70 years who wishes to die. Some slopes truly are slippery. Whereas in the first years after 2002, hardly any patients with psychiatric illnesses or dementia appeared in reports, these numbers are now sharply on the rise. Cases have been reported in which large numbers of the suffering of those given euthanasia or assisted suicide consisted in being aged, lonely or bereaved. Some of these patients could have lived for years or decades. Not even the review committees, despite hard and conscientious work, have been able to halt these developments. I used to be a supporter of the legislation, but now with 12 years of experience, I take a different view. Once the genie is out of the bottle, it's not likely to ever go back in again. And here is a graph. Again, I think the burden of proof rests with David Seymour and others to tell us why we should not be extremely alarmed by such frank turnarounds by a professional who was at the heart of supporting a change for euthanasia just a little over a decade ago. I must admit it's risky saying this at a university, but I could count on very few fingers, Murray, the number of academics I've heard say we got it terribly, terribly wrong and make an about turn like that. I'm sure theology is the exception. Something I've picked up on in comments by people like David Seymour, sometimes it's in talkback callers, sometimes it's in church, sometimes I notice it in myself, is something that I'm increasingly referring to as Kiwi exceptionalism. The New Zealand cultural detective authors identified 6 qualities commonly found in New Zealanders, individually and communally. These 6 are modesty, restraint, earthiness, informality, ingenuity, and fairness. And while each of those have benefits, unchecked, they can have negative effects, which the cultural detective authors picked up on. And so for fairness, they write, Kiwis are highly principled and known for integrity and impartiality. However, they also warn that it can give rise to a certain righteousness and hyper-democratic impulse. And I think that might be some of what I'm hearing when I hear people just refusing to accept that anything like what is happening overseas would happen here. We're not like the Dutch or the Americans. We're Kiwis. We're the home of fair go. We know a good deal when we see one. We'll be fine. It makes me nervous. I'm going to level a couple of challenges just to those in the room who have Christian faith. The rest of you can just point at them and say, yeah, you should be doing that. First is that I think we need to be very sympathetic to the suffering argument. Suffering lies at the heart of the Christian faith, and not in ways that I'm about to describe, but in joining others in that, helping them through that, bearing that with them. And Christians, myself included, have said some unwise and some pretty uncaring things. In hunting for the articles of Graham Adams, I came across this in an article he'd written a year earlier. Suffering is integral to the church's teaching about salvation. This last point is often overlooked in the debate about voluntary euthanasia, but was made vividly apparent to me in 2007 after my sister died in a Brisbane hospital tied to a bed, screaming in agony from cancer in her lungs, breast and spine. A few days after her death, a devoutly Catholic relative rang to say that she had heard my sister had died in horrific pain and tried to console me by saying that the good news was that her suffering hadn't been pointless because she wouldn't have to spend much time in purgatory. She went on to explain that enduring suffering patiently on earth is one way to cut your time in purgatory. I felt a little repentant when I read that, actually, and Graham Adams went from being a bit of a villain in my mind to someone that I felt a deep amount of sympathy for. And to have something said like that said to you at a time like that is pretty unforgivable. You wouldn't think it needed to be said, but Gilbert Melander does say we should, of course, not pretend that suffering in itself is a good thing, nor should we put forward claims about the benefits others can reap from their suffering. Again, it should go without saying that we should be moved. We should be moved by extremely difficult cases. That is part of it. Not just that. My final challenge is, are Christians ready to put some of their money and their time and their emotions where their mouth is and really, really care for the dying? People in the abortion debate, with Christian faith holding to a pro-life stance, have been accused of being more pro-birth than pro-life. You want to see the birth happen, but where are you for the next 18 years? And this, for me, is something where I've felt some of that same challenge. We need to take seriously Paul Ramsey's challenge to care for the dying, but to only care for the dying, refusing to both overtreat on the one hand or give up on the other. Both are forms of abandonment. Melander picks up on the good host analogy by saying, good hosts recognise certain boundaries. He neither kicks his guest out or presses him to stay when the time's come for the party to end. These boundaries correspond to the two opposite extremes, which Paul Ramsey suggested we have to avoid in caring for the dying. On the one hand, we ought not to choose death or aim at death, but on the other hand, neither should we act as if continued life were the only or even the highest good. It's not a God, but it's a gift of God. Thus, we should neither aim at death nor continue the struggle against it when its time has come. Allowing to die is permitted. Killing is not. Within these limits lies the sphere of our freedom. That caring is going to cost us. And I was reminded as I prepared for this lecture again that for about the last 5 years, I've been saying to myself, I've said it a couple of times to my wife, that we have 3 rest homes within about 5 kilometres of our place, and that I've said I should volunteer to actually read stories to people, read to people who can no longer read for themselves. And I've been talking it up for 5 years and I've never done it. I mean, I love the sound of my own voice. It would be win-win to do that. But I haven't done that. I haven't actually done my little bit for helping someone in the twilight years of their life. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's someone out there who's looking forward to euthanasia because Sam Bloore hasn't turned up to read them a book. What I am saying is that I've placed out there the issue and not done things that cost me time, that I'm actually sure would be thoroughly enriching as I did it. So that's the challenge I leave us with. If we are going to embrace a law change, and I have days where I think it's inevitable and other days where I think it's not. But if we are, I do want us to call it how it is. I do want us to be honest about what has happened overseas and say that that will happen here, and that is a trade-off that we're prepared to make. Thanks for listening. I've gone way over time.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. We had planned to wrap up at 6:30, and for those who do need to go now, please feel free to do so. But I want to allow maybe just 10 minutes for anybody who does have questions or comments they would like to make. And I'll bring the mic round because we are recording.
Thank you. I have spent 45 years in general practice, including 10 years in palliative care. And one of the things about suffering that I think we tend to forget, but we need to pay attention to in this, is that those who are dying have a family around them who suffer with them. And we don't acknowledge enough the suffering of the family, so that sometimes it's the family that want the end rather than the patient. And I can honestly say that in 10 years in the hospice, I had several requests from family to hurry things up, but only ever one from a patient who, like the patients that you described, as he became comfortable and lost his fear, he actually settled down and stopped saying, I want to die tomorrow.
Yeah.
So that I think that's an extremely important issue to attend to. The other thing is that there's a marvellous film about to be released called Not an Ordinary Sheila, about Sheila Natouche. Okay. And in that, there is a sequence where Sheila Natouche and a friend of hers have a discussion about dying. And she actually was dying of cancer, and so was he. And it is the most marvellous discussion about dying peacefully, because that's the time that's come, which I've ever heard.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And Sam did indicate to me he didn't feel that he needed to have to respond to all the comments. We're inviting conversation together. But if you want to respond,
just
Sam,
say one thing very, very briefly about the suffering of relatives. We had a moment down in Christchurch where, at a panel we did, where a gentleman stood up and basically said he'd cared for his wife for 10 years. And it was one of the most harrowing stories I've heard. And we had several on the panel, and one of them sort of jumped in with, but it still puts other people at risk. And then, fortunately, they got to the mic first. The second person who got to the mic was Rod, who was the palliative care doctor. And he just stood up and apologised to the man on behalf of all of us for not being there to help him through that period of time. And he just apologised for somehow him slipping through the cracks and not having support at what sounded like just a horrendous time. So it was a beautiful moment actually of acknowledging the very suffering that you're talking about. And so that's all I'll say to that, because I don't.
Any other question? Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam, for that presentation. It was excellent, and I appreciated that challenge at the end for all of us. Just wanted to ask, you mentioned the jurisdiction of the Netherlands, Belgium and Oregon.
Yes.
What other jurisdictions are there that have opened the door, and are there any that have managed to kind of contain it?
Yeah. I'm a little stuck in that I'm playing 20 years of catch-up on the topic with this in terms of where everyone sits in terms of it going through. Canada, it definitely has. Australia are considering it. But what's the other one that... Switzerland, sorry, yes, is another one that has it. But there are a number of them actually thinking about it. I had an interesting chat to a girl at my church a few weeks ago who comes from Brazil. And she's mad as anything that New Zealand is considering it, because she said you don't realise when a less developed country, when they watch a developed country put this through, it often opens the floodgates. So she was livid that we've got as close as we have, because she said countries like Brazil, where there's enormous financial pressure on them, to actually look for ways to save money in their healthcare systems, they often will take their cues from other places.
And has any jurisdictions managed to contain it at all that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, if you talk to different people, you'll hear them say that it's fine. And in some ways, I kind of wish I hadn't read those gentlemen that I have. I think I'd be feeling more relaxed about it if I didn't have people, the calibre of those gentlemen, writing as frankly and as honestly as they are about it. That's what makes me nervous. And it makes me nervous when the pressure's coming from people wanting in. And so, I hear Lance O'Sullivan, I hear Geoffrey Palmer, Geoffrey Palmer, QC, he's gone over it with a fine-tooth comb. I'm like, great, but what if people want in? It's a very, very difficult when someone's saying, I want the goodies, what's holding me back? It's only this little change. I'm not quite as terminal. My tumour's not quite as bad. It becomes very difficult.
Any other questions or comments?
Again, thank you for the presentation. I've had very, very close, a wife die of cancer. Fought for 4 years, and the last 3 weeks she said, I've had enough, gave up. That's my own personal conviction that we fought it, and it was her decision. Yes. Had she at any stage said, I want you to assist me to die, I would have, because she had really fought so hard and everything was so badly against her. There was no hope whatsoever.
Yes.
We fought in that game. I just come back to you at another angle. I am a Christian, and the generation before me would not go to hospital because they knew they went there to die. The new generation doesn't understand the power of the hospice, that it's a place to live. And I think that has to be brought into the legislation, that people fear the hospice. They won't go there for pain relief. They won't, and people won't come and visit, almost that they might catch something when they come through the door. I'd like your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah. One of the observations we made going back to 1996 was that we saw that some of the demand for euthanasia was of the medical profession's own making. I had, sat as medical registrars, had bets on who wouldn't lose a patient and do some quite, at times, heroic, and not in a good way, heroic things to make sure that it didn't happen on their shift, as though there was almost this kind of sort of competition. Now, I'm not saying everyone's like that, but I think there has been a bit of a failure to be humble in those situations. Otago, in his book around being mortal, so he's a doctor from the US, wrote a great book, was actually out for the Auckland Writers Festival 2 years ago. He opens the book with, I learned almost nothing about dying in medical school. I learned how to preserve life, how to do an extra thing. He talks about the death of Ivan Ilyich, Tolstoy's novella, and said, as at one of our Friday afternoon sessions that was supposed to make us more well-rounded, we read this novella, and in the novella, if you've ever read it, Ivan Tolstoy becomes sick, and he knows he's dying, but no one will actually admit it, and no one will do anything to actually have that conversation with him. And what causes him the most pain isn't his illness, but that no one will actually talk frankly with him about what is happening. Gawande then compares that to a patient they had called Mr. Lazaroff, where he said the same thing happened with his team. They didn't know how to have the conversation with him, that the end was nigh. They just had another treatment they could try, and it's almost like they were hiding behind that. He has this line in the book, I sometimes wonder who was the more primitive, Ivan Ilyich's kind of doctors of the late 19th century or us. We seem to be hiding behind that same kind of facade. So I think there's rightfully a nervousness by people about going into a setting like that where they're going to lose control. I'm not sure how well people know what is available through hospice and palliative care. I didn't until just, a flatbed truck rocked up with a bed on it that was all electrified, and we had Dad at home for those, for that final season of time, which we're deeply, deeply grateful for. And that's in Dargaville, that's not a main centre. So, there are energies being poured into making that more available for people.
Perhaps I just might add that it's very esoteric. We're talking to people who are learning, but I think the bottom part, the fatalistic part of society,
right,
got no understanding of that whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, folks, we will wrap it up there. Sorry, we've done our 10 minutes, but thank you all for your willingness to stay on. I think that's a very good indication, actually, of the point Sam made at the beginning, that we need to take time to discuss this issue much more seriously and much more carefully than is commonly done in the midst of this debate through the media and so on. So thank you for your commitment to that tonight, and thank you, Sam, for helping us with it.
Apologies.